The groom thought he knew exactly who would leave that church heartbroken. He was wrong. The stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Chapel glowed with the soft amber light of a late September afternoon, painting ribbons of gold and crimson across polished oak pews. Outside, maple leaves drifted lazily through the cool Connecticut air, gathering along the stone pathway that led toward the towering wooden doors. Inside, nearly 200 guests filled the chapel with the low hum of conversation, the scent of fresh white roses hanging delicately beneath the vaulted ceiling. It looked like the perfect wedding. That was exactly what Ryan Mitchell wanted everyone to believe. Standing near the altar in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, Ryan wore the confident smile that had carried him through boardrooms, courtrooms, and countless situations where charm had mattered more than truth. The guests admired him. Some envied him. Others whispered about how fortunate he was to be marrying Sophia Bennett, the successful owner of one of New England's most respected art galleries. Sophia came from an old Connecticut family. Ryan came from ambition. Together, they looked like a magazine cover. But Ryan's attention wasn't on the altar. It wasn't on the floral arrangements or the musicians tuning their instruments. It wasn't even on the woman who would soon walk down the aisle. His eyes kept drifting toward the last row. Toward her. Emma Carter sat alone beneath the shadow of the rear balcony. She wore a simple navy blue dress and a pair of modest pearl earrings. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to attract attention. In fact, most people probably wouldn't have noticed her if Ryan hadn't made certain she received an invitation. 5 years earlier, Emma had been his wife. 3 years earlier, she had signed divorce papers while fighting back tears in a lawyer's office. Today, she sat quietly at the wedding where Ryan planned to begin the next chapter of his life. At least, that was how he saw it. A few guests recognized her immediately. Heads turned. Whispers traveled from pew to pew. Emma felt them moving around her. Like a cold breeze. She kept her hands folded calmly in her lap. Her expression never changed. She had almost declined the invitation. For 3 weeks, the embossed envelope had sat unopened on her kitchen counter beside stacks of student artwork waiting to be graded. She taught art classes at a public middle school now. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the life Ryan once promised her. But it was peaceful. Eventually, curiosity had won. Not because she cared about Ryan anymore. Not because she wanted closure. Closure was a myth people invented when they didn't know how to live with unanswered questions. No, Emma came because she wanted proof. Proof that she could sit in the same room as her past and survive it. Across the chapel, Ryan adjusted his cufflinks and exchanged a few words with guests. Every few minutes, he glanced toward Emma. The look wasn't subtle. It carried the quiet satisfaction of a man convinced he had won. Near the front row sat Vanessa Cole. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over one shoulder, and the diamond bracelet around her wrist caught the sunlight every time she moved. Years ago, Vanessa had been Ryan's colleague. Then she became his emotional confidant. Then something more. Emma recognized her immediately. Of course she did. Some faces never leave your memory. Vanessa leaned close to Ryan and whispered something that made him laugh. The sound drifted faintly through the chapel. Emma felt a familiar ache stir somewhere deep inside her chest. Not heartbreak. That wound had healed long ago. It was something stranger. The realization that people who once caused enormous pain eventually become ordinary. Smaller than the memories they leave behind. Emma lowered her gaze. She focused on the wedding program resting in her hands. The cream-colored paper listed every detail of the ceremony. The musicians, the readings, the vows. Everything appeared perfectly planned. Yet something felt off. She couldn't explain it. She simply felt it. A subtle tension beneath the polished surface. Like a crack hidden beneath fresh paint. Near the front, guests suddenly straightened in their seats. The musicians began to play. A gentle piano melody floated. Through the chapel, conversations disappeared. The enormous doors at the entrance slowly opened. Everyone turned toward the aisle. Emma looked up with the rest of the crowd. And then she saw Sophia Bennett. The bride stood framed by afternoon sunlight, her ivory gown flowing around her like liquid silk. Gasps of admiration rippled through the chapel. She was beautiful, elegant, poised, yet the expression on her face wasn't what Emma expected. Sophia wasn't smiling. She wasn't nervous either. She looked focused, deliberate, almost as though she had already made an important decision before stepping through those doors. Ryan's face brightened instantly. He stood taller, confident, victorious. The bride began walking slowly down the aisle. Cameras flashed. Guests smiled. Some wiped tears from their eyes. It was everything a wedding was supposed to be. Yet Sophia barely looked at Ryan. Once, twice, 3 times. Her eyes drifted past the altar, past the guests, all the way to the final row, directly to Emma. The first time, Emma assumed it was accidental. The second time, it felt intentional. The third time, it sent a chill down her spine. For one brief moment, Sophia's gaze held hers. Not with anger, not with jealousy, not with pity. It was something far more unsettling. Recognition. As though the bride and the ex-wife shared a secret nobody else in that chapel understood. Emma's fingers tightened around the wedding program. Ryan never noticed. He was too busy admiring the future he thought belonged to him. But somewhere between the opening notes of the wedding march and the bride's slow approach to the altar, a truth invisible to everyone else had already begun unfolding. And before the day was over, the last woman Ryan expected would change everything. Emma could not explain why Sophia's eyes lingered on her as the bride continued her slow walk toward the altar. The moment lasted only seconds, yet it settled heavily in her mind. By the time Sophia reached the front of the chapel, the musicians had shifted into a softer melody, and the guests were smiling once again, unaware that anything unusual had happened. Ryan certainly seemed unaware. Standing beside the officiant, he looked exactly like a man getting everything he had ever wanted. Emma lowered her gaze, trying to dismiss the strange feeling growing in her chest. Perhaps she was imagining things. Perhaps Sophia had simply been nervous and happened to glance toward the back row. It would not have been unusual. Weddings made people emotional. Weddings made people unpredictable. Yet something about Sophia's expression had felt deliberate, thoughtful, almost familiar. The ceremony began. The officiant welcomed family and friends. The audience listened politely. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, scattering patches of sapphire and gold across the floor. Everything appeared perfect, but Emma found herself paying less attention to the words and more attention to Sophia. The bride stood gracefully beside Ryan, listening, nodding when appropriate. Yet there was a distance in her eyes that seemed impossible to ignore once Emma noticed it. It was the look of someone carrying a secret. 3 months earlier, Emma had received an unexpected email on a rainy Thursday evening. She remembered the moment clearly because she had been sitting at her kitchen table grading watercolor projects from her 7th grade art students. Outside her apartment window, rain tapped gently against the glass while a baseball game played quietly on television. She had nearly deleted the message without reading it. The sender's name meant nothing to her at first. Sophia Bennett. The subject line had been simple. We need to talk. Emma had stared at the screen for nearly a minute before opening it. The message was polite, brief. Sophia explained that she knew who Emma was. She knew about the marriage. She knew about the divorce. And she wanted to meet. Nothing more. No accusations. No explanations. No hostility. Emma almost ignored it. After all, what possible reason could Ryan's fiancée have for contacting her? But curiosity had eventually overcome caution. 2 days later, they met at a small coffee shop overlooking Long Island Sound. Emma remembered arriving first. The cafe smelled of cinnamon pastries and fresh espresso. Rain clouds drifted over the water outside. She expected tension. She expected confrontation. Instead, Sophia had walked in wearing jeans and a cream-colored sweater, looking less like a wealthy gallery owner and more like an exhausted woman carrying questions she could not answer. For several minutes they simply talked. About work. About Connecticut. About art. It felt strangely normal. Then Sophia finally asked the question that mattered. What really happened between you and Ryan? Emma had sat quietly for a moment. She could have unloaded years of disappointment. She could have recited every argument, every betrayal, every sleepless night. Instead, she simply told the truth. Ryan had not been cruel in obvious ways. That was what made it so difficult to explain. He had a talent for making people doubt themselves. He always seemed reasonable, always persuasive, always charming, even when he was wrong, especially when he was wrong. Emma described how their marriage slowly became a performance centered around Ryan's ambitions, how every sacrifice somehow became expected, how every disagreement became her fault. Sophia listened carefully. She never interrupted. She never defended him. She simply listened. When they finally parted ways, Emma assumed that would be the end of it. Yet 2 weeks later, Sophia asked to meet again. Then again after that. The conversations became longer, more personal. Sophia began sharing things she had noticed herself. Small inconsistencies, strange stories that never quite matched, promises Ryan made and later denied making. Tiny details that seemed insignificant on their own, but troubling when viewed together. Emma never encouraged suspicion. She never told Sophia what to think. She only answered questions honestly. Over time, something unexpected happened. The two women stopped talking about Ryan altogether. They talked about life, about careers, about family, about rebuilding confidence after disappointment. Sophia admitted that before meeting Emma, she had expected bitterness. Instead, she found someone who seemed surprisingly at peace. That bothered her more than anger would have, because peaceful people rarely spend years inventing lies about the past. A month later, Sophia quietly began asking questions of her own. She spoke with former coworkers. She reviewed old timelines. She paid attention to details she had ignored before, and what she found unsettled her. The image Ryan presented to the world did not always match reality. Not completely, not consistently. None of it was dramatic enough to create a scandal. But piece by piece, the foundation beneath her relationship began to crack. Back inside St. Matthew's Chapel, the officiant continued speaking. Guests smiled through sentimental readings. Ryan occasionally squeezed Sophia's hand. She responded politely. Yet Emma noticed something nobody else seemed to notice. Sophia's smile never quite reached her eyes. The bride looked calm, composed, certain, as though she had already arrived at a destination nobody else could see. Then, during a brief pause in the ceremony, Sophia looked toward the back row once more. Her eyes found Emma immediately. This time there was no mistaking it. No coincidence. No accident. And for the briefest moment, Sophia gave the smallest nod. A silent acknowledgement. A message hidden in plain sight. Emma felt her pulse quicken. Around them, the chapel remained wrapped in elegant perfection. The flowers still smelled sweet. The music still floated gently through the air. The guests still believed they were witnessing the beginning of a beautiful future. But Emma suddenly realized something none of them understood yet. Sophia Bennett had not walked into this church uncertain. She had walked into it with a plan. The silence after Sophia's subtle nod felt louder than the music filling St. Matthew's Chapel. Emma sat motionless, her heart beating faster with every passing second. She did not know exactly what Sophia intended to do, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next had been planned long before today. At the altar, Ryan appeared completely relaxed. He smiled at family members seated near the front. He exchanged confident glances with friends from his law firm. Every gesture reflected the certainty of a man who believed the future was unfolding exactly as he had designed it. The officiant continued guiding the ceremony forward. Stories about love were shared. Passages about commitment echoed through the chapel. Guests listened with soft smiles and misty eyes. Yet beneath the elegant surface, Emma could feel the tension growing. It was like standing beside the ocean moments before a storm arrives. 3 weeks earlier, Sophia had invited Emma to her gallery after closing hours. The building sat near the waterfront, surrounded by historic brick storefronts and tree-lined sidewalks. Emma remembered walking through the quiet exhibition hall beneath soft golden lighting. Paintings worth thousands of dollars lined the walls, but Sophia barely looked at them. Instead, she led Emma into a private office overlooking the harbor. Neither woman spoke immediately. Outside, sailboats drifted across dark water beneath a fading sunset. Finally, Sophia opened a folder resting on her desk. Inside were printed emails, timelines, notes, and photographs. Nothing scandalous, nothing dramatic. Yet together they told a story that made her impossible to ignore. Ryan had spent years presenting himself as a man of integrity, a dependable partner, a trustworthy professional. But Sophia had discovered a pattern. Half-truths, contradictions, convenient omissions. Every uncomfortable question seemed to lead toward another explanation, another excuse, another carefully crafted version of reality. The deeper she looked, the more she realized she no longer trusted the man she planned to marry. Emma had remained quiet while Sophia spoke. She never celebrated being proven right. She never criticized Ryan. In many ways, that was what affected Sophia the most. Emma showed no desire for revenge, no bitterness, no satisfaction. Only sadness for what had once been and acceptance of what could never be changed. Before Emma left that evening, Sophia asked a question she would never forget. If you were me, would you still go through with the wedding? Emma looked out the window toward the harbor lights reflecting across the water. Then she answered honestly, I cannot tell you what to do, but whatever choice you make sure it belongs to you and not to the version of yourself someone else expects you to be. Back in the chapel, those words echoed quietly inside Sophia's mind. The officiant smiled warmly as the ceremony approached the exchange of vows. Guests leaned forward in anticipation. Cameras were raised. Parents exchanged emotional glances. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Ryan took Sophia's hands and looked into her eyes. The expression on his face was filled with confidence, perhaps even relief. He believed every obstacle was behind him now. The difficult questions, the uncomfortable conversations, the doubts Sophia had expressed over recent months. He assumed they had all disappeared. Sophia looked at him carefully. For a brief moment, she remembered the man she thought she had fallen in love with. The charming attorney with ambitious dreams and effortless confidence. But standing before her now was not that man. Or perhaps he never had been. The realization no longer hurt. It simply felt clear. Around them, sunlight continued streaming through the stained glass windows. White roses lined the aisle. The chapel remained beautiful. Yet Sophia suddenly understood something important. Beautiful settings could not transform dishonesty into truth. Elegant ceremonies could not create trust where trust no longer existed. The officiant turned toward the couple and asked them to prepare for the next step of the ceremony. A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. Ryan squeezed Sophia's hands gently. His smile widened. Across the room, Vanessa watched from the front row with visible excitement. Family members exchanged hopeful glances. Emma felt her stomach tighten. She could not predict exactly what Sophia would do, but she sensed the moment had arrived. Sophia slowly inhaled. Then she turned her head, not toward the officiant, not toward Ryan. Her eyes traveled once again to the final row of the chapel, directly to Emma. This time there was no subtle nod, no hidden signal, only certainty. Calm, unwavering certainty. The expression on Sophia's face made Emma's breath catch in her throat. It was the look of someone who had finally chosen herself. And as the chapel waited for the next words to be spoken, not a single person in the room realized that the ceremony they came to witness was already beginning to unravel. For a suspended moment, the entire chapel seemed to stop breathing. The officiant waited patiently, assuming the pause belonged to emotion. Weddings were filled with emotional pauses. Nobody thought twice about a bride gathering herself before making a lifelong promise. Nobody except Sophia. She was not gathering courage to say yes. She was gathering courage to tell the truth. Ryan's smile remained fixed in place, though a faint crease appeared between his brows. He followed her gaze toward the back of the chapel and finally noticed Emma sitting quietly beneath the balcony. The sight seemed to confuse him. Why was Sophia looking at her now? Why did she keep looking at her at all? Sophia slowly released one of Ryan's hands. The movement was subtle, almost invisible, yet Ryan felt it immediately. He glanced down, then back at her face. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The officiant smiled gently. Sophia, are you all right? The question echoed softly through the chapel. Sophia turned back toward the altar. Yes, she answered. Her voice was calm, steady, stronger than it had been in weeks. Several guests relaxed visibly. A few even laughed nervously. The ceremony continued. Yet Emma felt something shifting beneath the surface. She remembered the final conversation she and Sophia had shared 2 nights earlier. They had met at the gallery after closing time. The building had been quiet except for the distant hum of traffic beyond the harbor. Sophia stood beside a large landscape painting while staring out at the dark water. Everyone keeps asking if I am excited, she had said. But nobody asks if I am certain. Emma understood that feeling. For years people had asked her whether she was happy. Very few had ever asked whether she felt seen. Sophia had turned toward her. Do you know what scares me most? Emma shook her head. That I kept explaining away things that should have mattered. Every uncomfortable feeling, every doubt, every contradiction. I kept telling myself love meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Her voice had softened. But eventually you run out of doubt to give. Emma remembered standing quietly beside her. There was nothing left to advise. Sophia already knew the answer she was searching for. She only needed the courage to live with it. Back in the chapel, sunlight illuminated the diamond on Sophia's finger. The stone sparkled brilliantly as she looked down at it. Guests admired the image. To them, it represented romance, commitment, success. But Sophia saw something entirely different. She saw promises built on a foundation she no longer trusted. She saw a future that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Ryan shifted beside her. "Everything okay?" he whispered softly. His tone sounded caring, concerned, exactly the way everyone expected him to sound. Sophia studied him for a second. It amazed her how convincing he could be. Perhaps that was the problem. He had become so skilled at presenting the right version of himself that even he no longer seemed to know where the performance ended. "Everything is clear now," she replied quietly. Ryan smiled, misunderstanding her completely. Across the front row, Vanessa exchanged a pleased glance with one of Ryan's colleagues. Family members looked emotional. The photographer adjusted position to capture the perfect angle for the vows. The entire room remained focused on what was supposed to happen next. Nobody was prepared for what might happen instead. Emma felt her pulse quicken. She wished she could disappear into the pew and avoid becoming part of whatever was unfolding. Yet she knew that was impossible now. Sophia had made certain of it. The bride slowly turned away from Ryan and faced the guests. Murmurs rippled gently through the chapel. It was unusual, but not alarming. Not yet. Sophia's gaze moved across the crowd. She saw friends, family, business associates, people who loved her, people who admired Ryan, people who believed they understood the story standing before them. The realization brought a sad smile to her lips. They only knew the version they had been shown, the same version she once believed herself. Near the back, Emma sat perfectly still. She had no idea what Sophia intended to say. Yet something in the bride's expression told her this moment had been approaching for months, perhaps longer. The music had stopped completely now. Even the air seemed quiet. Sophia took a slow breath and looked directly toward the final row once more. This time, every guest followed her gaze. Heads turned one after another until dozens of eyes landed on Emma. Confusion spread through the chapel. Ryan's expression tightened. Vanessa frowned. The officiant looked uncertain. But Sophia remained calm, more certain than she had ever been. And as she stared at Emma beneath the golden lights streaming through the stained glass windows, everyone in the room sensed that the next words spoken inside St. Matthew's Chapel were about to change everything. Sophia let the silence linger, not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in a very long time, she was no longer rushing to make other people comfortable. The chapel remained frozen around her. Dozens of faces stared back with growing confusion. Ryan shifted his weight beside her, forcing a smile that now looked increasingly strained. "Sophia," he said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "Everyone is waiting." A few guests chuckled nervously. The sound faded almost immediately. Sophia looked at him for a moment. Then she glanced toward Emma again. The distance between the front of the chapel and the final row suddenly felt symbolic. One woman stood beneath chandeliers and flower arrangements. The other sat quietly in the shadows. Yet Sophia knew which of them had shown greater courage. "You are right," she said calmly. "Everyone has been waiting." Ryan relaxed slightly, assuming the moment was passing. But Sophia continued. "The problem is that they have been waiting for the wrong thing." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. The officiant opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. Sophia slowly removed her hand from Ryan's completely. The gesture was simple, quiet, yet it landed with the weight of a confession. Ryan's smile disappeared. "What are you doing?" he asked under his breath. Sophia ignored the question. Instead, she faced the guests. 3 months ago, she began, I believed I was standing at the beginning of the happiest chapter of my life. Her voice carried clearly through the chapel. I believed I knew the man I was marrying. Family members exchanged uneasy glances. Vanessa sat straighter in her seat. Emma remained motionless. Sophia continued. Then something unexpected happened. I met someone I had been told I should never trust. Several heads turned toward Emma again. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Sophia," he warned quietly, "do not do this." She looked at him with genuine sadness. "That is exactly what I used to tell myself every time something felt wrong. Do not ask questions. Do not look deeper. Do not do this." The words hung heavily in the air. Ryan's face paled. For the first time all day, he appeared uncertain. Not angry, not defensive, simply uncertain. Sophia turned back to the guests. I thought meeting Emma would confirm everything I believed about the past. Instead, it forced me to examine the present. The chapel had become so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Outside, a church bell rang somewhere in the distance. Sophia's eyes softened. What surprised me most was not what she said. It was what she did not say. She did not try to destroy anyone. She did not ask me to leave. She did not try to interfere with this wedding. Emma felt every eye in the room on her. Her face warmed, but she kept her gaze lowered. She simply told the truth when I asked for it. Sophia drew a slow breath. And the truth has a way of surviving, even when people spend years trying to bury it beneath explanations. Ryan stepped forward. This is not the place for this conversation. His voice remained controlled, but the confidence that once filled it was gone. Sophia smiled sadly. Actually, this is exactly the place. The statement struck the room like a thunderclap. Vanessa looked from Ryan to Sophia, clearly realizing that whatever was happening had moved far beyond a misunderstanding. The photographer slowly lowered his camera. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody could. Sophia looked around the chapel one final time. Every person here came to witness a promise, she said. And promises matter. That is why I cannot stand here and make one that I do not believe. A gasp escaped somewhere. Near the front row, Ryan stared at her as though he no longer recognized the woman before him. Yet Sophia felt calmer than she had in months. Perhaps years. Because uncertainty had finally ended. I deserve honesty, she said softly. And so does everyone else. Then she turned. Not toward the officiant. Not toward Ryan. Her eyes found Emma once more. There was gratitude in that look. Respect. Recognition. The kind of recognition that exists between two people who understand the same lesson through different pain. Emma felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Sophia took a single step away from the altar. Then another. The movement was small, yet it changed everything. Confusion swept through the guests. Ryan remained frozen where he stood. And as Sophia slowly descended from the altar platform, every person inside St. Matthew's Chapel realized the wedding they expected was no longer the wedding unfolding before their eyes. The sound of Sophia's heels against the polished floor echoed through the chapel with astonishing clarity. Each step felt impossibly loud in the silence. Guests watched her descend from the altar platform as though they were witnessing something they could not fully understand. Ryan remained motionless for several seconds before finally following her with his eyes. Sophia, he called softly. His voice carried uncertainty now. Not authority. Not confidence. Uncertainty. She paused halfway down the aisle, but did not turn around. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, wrapping her white gown in shades of gold and sapphire. The image should have looked bridal. Instead, it looked liberating. I spent months trying to convince myself that doubt was the problem, she said quietly. I thought if I ignored it long enough, certainty would eventually arrive. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the officiant stood frozen beside the altar. Sophia finally turned and faced Ryan. There was no anger in her expression. That was what made the moment so powerful. Anger fades. Disappointment remains. Do you remember our dinner in Boston last spring? She asked. Ryan blinked. The question clearly caught him off guard. What does that have to do with this? Everything, Sophia replied. She smiled sadly. That was the first time I noticed you telling two different versions of the same story to two different people. Ryan exhaled sharply. Everyone does that. No, Sophia said. Not everyone. The words landed heavily. Emma watched from the back row, feeling as though she were witnessing a conversation that should have happened years earlier. Not just for Sophia. For herself. For every moment she had spent doubting her own instincts because Ryan always seemed so convincing. Sophia took another step down the aisle. The more questions I asked, the more explanations appeared. Her gaze never left Ryan. And somehow every explanation required me to ignore what I could already see. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Family members shifted in their seats. Vanessa stared straight ahead, her expression becoming increasingly tense. Ryan forced a laugh that sounded hollow in the quiet chapel. You are making a mistake. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. That is exactly what I was afraid of. She glanced around the room. Then I realized something. Her voice softened. The bigger mistake would be standing at that altar and pretending trust still existed when it did not. The silence deepened. Outside, wind rustled through the maple trees surrounding the church. A A few red leaves drifted past the stained glass windows. The world continued moving forward while everything inside the chapel felt suspended in time. Sophia turned toward Emma again. 3 months ago, I expected to meet the villain in my story. A faint murmur moved through the guests. Emma lowered her eyes. Sophia continued. Instead, I met someone who had already survived it. The word struck Emma with surprising force. For years she had carried the quiet shame of being the woman whose marriage failed. The woman who could not make it work. The woman people pitied in whispers. Yet standing there now, Sophia was describing something entirely different. Not failure. Survival. Ryan shook his head. You are romanticizing the past. Sophia looked at him calmly. No, I am finally seeing it clearly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt far greater than the few yards of aisles separating them. It felt like years. Ryan looked around the chapel as though searching for support. But the room no longer belonged to him. The narrative no longer belonged to him. People were not watching the successful attorney everyone admired. They were watching a man confronted by consequences he never expected to face publicly. Sophia slowly reached for the diamond ring on her finger. The movement immediately captured every eye in the room. Ryan's expression changed. For the first time, genuine alarm appeared. Sophia, he said quietly. She slid the ring free and held it in her palm. Sunlight caught the stone one final time. This ring is beautiful, she said. But beautiful things are not always built on solid foundations. Nobody breathed. Nobody blinked. Sophia walked toward the front row. Ryan remained frozen behind her. She stopped beside a small arrangement of white roses and carefully placed the ring atop the polished wooden ledge beside it. No drama. No spectacle. No anger. Just a choice. A deliberate choice. Then she turned toward the back of the chapel once more. Toward Emma. Their eyes met across the crowded room. In that moment, neither woman needed words. Both understood what had happened. One had spent years rebuilding her life. The other had just chosen to save hers. And as Sophia took a step toward the center aisle, leaving the altar behind, the guests finally began to realize that this day would not be remembered for a wedding. It would be remembered for the moment a woman stopped ignoring the truth and chose herself instead. For several long seconds, nobody seemed to know what to do. The guests remained seated, trapped between etiquette and disbelief. St. Matthew's Chapel had been prepared for celebration. Instead, it had become a place of revelation. Ryan stood alone near the altar, staring at the ring resting beside the white roses. The sight seemed almost unreal. Minutes earlier, it had represented certainty. Now it looked like evidence. Evidence that certainty could disappear faster than anyone imagined. Sophia continued walking down the aisle. Not hurriedly. Not dramatically. Simply with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally stopped negotiating with her own instincts. Her gown whispered softly across the polished floor. Every step carried her farther from the future she had almost chosen. Emma watched in stunned silence. She had spent years imagining different versions of justice. None of them looked like this. None of them involved another woman seeing the truth for herself. None of them involved compassion replacing competition. Sophia stopped several feet from the final row. The distance between them was small now, close enough for Emma to see the faint sheen of tears in her eyes. Not tears of heartbreak, tears of relief. There was a difference. Ryan finally moved. He stepped away from the altar. Sophia, please. His voice echoed through the chapel. Can we talk about this privately? The request sounded reasonable. That was what Ryan had always been good at. He knew how to make every situation appear smaller than it really was. How to transform patterns into misunderstandings. How to turn consequences into conversations. Sophia looked back at him. For a moment, Emma saw genuine sadness cross her face. Not because she doubted her decision. Because she understood exactly who Ryan was. We have talked privately for months, Sophia said softly. That is why we are here. Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again. The response he wanted would not come. Around him, people were beginning to see what Emma had seen years ago. Not a monster. Not a villain from a movie. Something more ordinary and more disappointing. A man who spent so much time controlling the narrative that he forgot the truth still existed underneath it. Vanessa rose slowly from her seat. Her expression was pale, confused, hurt. She looked toward Ryan, waiting for reassurance. Waiting for an explanation that could restore the world she believed she understood. But Ryan had none. For the first time, charm abandoned him. Sophia turned back toward Emma. The chapel faded into the background. The whispers, the confusion, the judgment, none of it mattered. "Thank you," she said quietly. Emma blinked. "For what?" Sophia smiled faintly. "For refusing. To become what pain tried to make you." The words settled deeply inside Emma. For years she had worried that surviving her divorce meant becoming cynical, guarded, bitter. Yet somehow she had resisted. Not perfectly, not gracefully every day, but enough. Enough to build a peaceful life. Enough to remain herself. Sophia took another step closer. "When I first contacted you, I expected resentment." Emma let out a small breath. "There were days when I felt it." "I know." Sophia nodded. "But you never used it against me." Nearby, several guests listened quietly. The tension in the room had changed. Earlier, it had been fueled by shock. Now it felt reflective, as though people were reconsidering assumptions they had carried into the chapel. Emma looked down briefly before meeting Sophia's eyes again. "You made your own choice." Sophia smiled. "Because you reminded me I could." The statement struck Emma harder than she expected. Outside the stained glass windows, afternoon sunlight began shifting toward evening. Golden light filled the chapel, wrapping everything in warmth. The scene felt strangely peaceful despite the chaos. Ryan remained near the altar, isolated not by distance, but by understanding. He could still hear every word. He could see every face. Yet for perhaps the first time in his life, he could not control what people believed. He could not rewrite what they had witnessed. The story belonged to others now. Sophia extended her hand toward Emma, not as a grand gesture, not as a performance, simply as an invitation. Emma looked at it for a moment. Around them, dozens of people watched. Then she stood from the pew and accepted it. A quiet murmur swept through the chapel. Two women who had every reason to view each other as rivals stood side by side instead. And somehow that image carried more power than the wedding anyone had come to see. Neither woman spoke. They did not need to. Some truths became stronger in silence. And as the late afternoon sun poured through the stained glass, illuminating the aisle ahead of them, both women understood that this was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a different one. Emma had never imagined that simply. Standing beside another woman could feel so significant. Yet as she and Sophia faced the chapel together, the atmosphere continued to shift in ways neither of them could have predicted. The whispers had softened. The shock remained, but something else had joined it now. Understanding. Guests who arrived expecting a celebration were beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something far rarer than a wedding. They were witnessing honesty. Sophia slowly lowered her hand, though she remained beside Emma. The distance she had traveled from the altar was only a few yards. The emotional distance was immeasurable. Across the chapel, Ryan finally seemed to understand that this moment could not be managed. He could not charm it away. He could not redirect it. He could not convince everyone they had misunderstood what they had seen. The image was too clear. The bride had walked away from certainty because certainty had never truly existed. A woman seated near the middle pew quietly wiped tears from her eyes. An older gentleman beside her removed his glasses and stared thoughtfully at the floor. Even those who knew nothing about the details could recognize authenticity when they saw it. Sophia turned slightly toward the guests. "I know this is not the day any of you expected," she said gently. "It is not the day I expected either." Her voice remained calm. There was no embarrassment in it. No apology. Only truth. But there comes a point when continuing forward becomes harder than changing direction. Several people nodded almost instinctively. Those words felt larger than the wedding itself. They touched something universal. The fear of disappointing others. The fear of changing course. The fear of admitting that a dream no longer fits reality. Emma listened quietly. She could see the weight lifting from Sophia with every sentence. Months of uncertainty seemed to be dissolving in real time. Not because the future had become easier, because it had become honest. Near the front row, Vanessa finally stood. Her expression was unreadable. She looked toward Ryan first, then toward Sophia. For a moment, Emma expected confrontation. Instead, Vanessa simply seemed lost. The certainty she carried into the chapel had vanished too. In that realization, Emma felt an unexpected wave of compassion. Pain had a way of humbling everyone eventually. Sophia noticed her as well. Their eyes met briefly. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing left to prove. Ryan took a slow breath and stepped forward. Sophia, he said, his voice quieter than before. If you had concerns, we could have worked through them. Sophia smiled sadly. That is the problem. Ryan frowned. What does that mean? It means I spent months trying to work through concerns that should never have existed in the first place. The answer settled heavily over the room. Ryan lowered his gaze. For the first time, he appeared exhausted. Not defeated. Exhausted. Like someone who had spent years maintaining a version of himself that finally became too difficult to carry. Emma watched him carefully. Strangely, she felt no triumph. No satisfaction. Only distance. The emotions that once controlled her had long since burned away. What remained was perspective. Ryan was no longer the center of her story. He had not been for years. Sophia glanced toward the stained glass windows where the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent. Colors danced across the pews in brilliant shades of gold, crimson, and blue. The chapel looked beautiful. More beautiful, somehow, than it had at the beginning of the ceremony. Perhaps because appearances no longer mattered. When I was younger, Sophia said softly, I thought strength meant staying committed no matter what. I thought walking away was weakness. She paused. Now I understand that sometimes walking away is the strongest thing a person can do. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that settles over a room when people recognize a truth they needed to hear. Emma felt something loosen inside her chest. For years, she had carried invisible questions. Had she stayed too long? Had she left too soon? Had she failed somehow? Listening to Sophia speak, she realized those questions no longer mattered. Survival was not failure. Starting over was not failure. Choosing peace was not failure. Sophia turned toward her again and smiled. This time the smile reached her eyes completely. It was warm, grateful, free. And as the golden afternoon light filled St. Matthew's Chapel, both women understood that while one future had ended today, another had quietly begun. The first person to move was not Ryan. It was his mother. Seated near the front of the chapel in a tailored ivory suit, Diane Mitchell had spent the entire afternoon maintaining the composed elegance expected of her. Yet now she slowly rose from her seat and looked towards Sophia with an expression that seemed to carry equal parts surprise and respect. For years, she had admired confidence. What she was witnessing now was something rarer. Conviction. The guests remained seated, as though leaving would somehow break the fragile honesty that had settled over the room. Nobody wanted to interrupt it. Nobody wanted to be the first person to pretend nothing important had happened. Emma noticed several faces she recognized from her marriage. Former friends. Former colleagues. People who once disappeared when her life became complicated. Yet their expressions had changed. The assumptions they carried into the chapel no longer fit what they had witnessed. Across the room, Ryan stood alone beneath the stained glass light. The colorful reflections painted his suit in shades of blue and gold. It should have been a triumphant image. Instead, it felt strangely lonely. For the first time, nobody was looking at him for answers. Nobody was waiting for him to explain the story. Sophia had already done that. Not through accusations. Through choices. Ryan finally looked toward Emma. Their eyes met briefly. Years earlier, that moment would have shattered her composure. She would have searched his face for regret, for validation, for some sign that their history had mattered. Now she felt none of those things. What surprised her most was how ordinary he seemed. The man who once occupied every corner of her thoughts now felt like a chapter she had finished reading long ago. Sophia noticed the exchange. "Do you know something strange?" she asked quietly. Emma turned toward her. "What?" Sophia smiled faintly. "I spent months being afraid of making the wrong choice." She glanced toward the altar. "But the moment I made it, the fear disappeared." Emma understood exactly what she meant. Courage was rarely the absence of fear. More often, it arrived after the decision had already been made. The realization settled warmly inside her. Near the front row, Vanessa slowly gathered her purse. She looked tired. Not angry. Simply tired. Before leaving, she glanced once toward Ryan. Whatever future she imagined this morning had clearly changed as well. Without speaking, she turned and walked toward the chapel doors. The sound of her footsteps faded into the distance. Ryan watched her go, but did not follow. He seemed to understand that some moments could not be repaired through explanation. The large wooden doors at the back of the chapel opened briefly as cool autumn air drifted inside. The scent of maple leaves and fresh grass mixed with the fragrance of white roses. Outside, Late afternoon sunlight washed over the stone courtyard. The day remained beautiful despite everything. Or perhaps because of everything. Sophia looked around the chapel one final time. "I am sorry for the confusion," she said gently to the guests. "But I am not sorry for the truth." Nobody objected. In fact, several people nodded. One woman even offered a quiet smile. The response seemed to surprise Sophia. She had expected judgment. Instead, she found understanding. People were often more forgiving of honesty than fear allowed us to believe. Emma felt an unexpected sense of pride. Not for herself. For Sophia. Walking away from something wrong was difficult. Walking away publicly was something else entirely. The sunlight continued shifting across the floor as afternoon slowly surrendered to evening. The chapel that had begun the day as a stage for promises now felt like a place of transformation. Ryan lowered his gaze and exhaled deeply. There was no dramatic confrontation, no angry speech, no desperate attempt to regain control, just silence. The kind of silence that arrives when reality finally catches up with perception. Sophia reached for Emma's hand once more. "Would you walk outside with me?" she asked. Emma smiled. "Of course." Together, they began moving toward the open doors. The guests parted naturally, creating a path through the center aisle. Some offered encouraging smiles. Others simply watched quietly. Yet every expression carried the same message. Respect. As they approached the exit, golden sunlight spilled through the doorway and stretched across the floor like a welcome. Neither woman knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. They did not need to. For the first time, tomorrow belonged entirely to them. And behind them, inside the fading colors of St. Matthew's Chapel, the life built on appearances remained standing alone, while two women stepped forward into something far more valuable than certainty. They stepped forward into truth. The moment Emma and Sophia stepped beyond the chapel doors, a cool autumn breeze greeted them like a quiet blessing. The stone courtyard stretched before them, framed by towering maple trees whose leaves glowed amber and crimson beneath the late afternoon sun. For the first time all day, neither woman felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching them. The noise of the chapel faded behind thick wooden doors, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant ringing of church bells from across town. Sophia released a long breath and closed her eyes briefly. "I forgot what fresh air felt like," she said softly. Emma smiled. "Sometimes you do not realize how hard you have been holding your breath until you finally stop." Sophia laughed quietly. It was the first genuine laugh Emma had heard from her in months. Not nervous, not forced, real. They walked slowly across the courtyard. Neither seemed eager to leave. The day had changed too much, too quickly. Both needed time to catch up with it. Behind them, guests slowly began exiting the chapel in small groups. Conversations remained subdued. Nobody seemed interested in gossip. The mood was strangely thoughtful. More than one person approached Sophia to offer support. Several women hugged her. A few men shook her hand. Nobody criticized her decision. If anything, the respect in their eyes appeared stronger than before. Across the courtyard, Ryan finally emerged from the chapel. He paused at the top of the stone steps and looked around. For a moment, he seemed uncertain where to go. The reception venue waited less than half a mile away. Caterers, musicians, floral arrangements, and months of planning still existed. Yet the future they were designed for no longer did. Emma noticed him first. Sophia followed her gaze. Neither woman spoke immediately. Ryan remained standing beneath the fading sunlight, his shoulders slightly slumped. The image surprised Emma. For years she had viewed him as someone impossible to shake, someone who always landed on his feet. Yet now he looked like any other person confronting the consequences of a choice. Not powerful, not intimidating, human. Sophia watched him quietly. "I do not hate him," she admitted. Emma nodded. "I know. I thought I would." Sophia folded her arms against the cool breeze. "But I do not." Emma understood. Hatred required emotional investment. What Sophia felt now was clarity. The two were very different. Nearby, a group of guests passed them while heading toward the parking area. One older woman paused beside Sophia. Her silver hair shimmered beneath the golden light. "You were brave today," she said simply. Then she continued walking before Sophia could respond. The words lingered. Brave. Sophia had spent most of her life believing bravery looked dramatic. Grand speeches, fearless actions, extraordinary moments. Today taught her something different. Sometimes bravery was simply refusing to ignore what you already knew. Emma slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat. What happens now? Sophia looked toward the horizon where the sun hung low above the trees. Honestly, Emma nodded. Sophia smiled. I have no idea. They both laughed. The answer felt surprisingly comforting. For months, Sophia believed she needed every detail of her future planned before making a difficult decision. Yet standing there now, uncertainty no longer frightened her. It felt freeing. The future did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be honest. Ryan finally began walking across the courtyard. Not toward them, toward the parking lot. He never looked back. Emma watched him disappear between rows of vehicles until he was gone entirely. The sight carried none of the triumph she once imagined. Instead, it felt like the closing scene of a chapter that had already ended long ago. Sophia followed his departure with her eyes. Then she turned away first. That small choice felt important. Years from now, she suspected she would remember that moment. Not because Ryan left, because she no longer needed him to stay. The evening light deepened, bathing the courtyard in gold. Around them, guests gradually departed until only a handful remained. The world continued moving forward, exactly as it always had. Emma looked at Sophia and saw something remarkable. The fear that once clouded her expression was gone. In its place stood a woman who had chosen herself despite the cost. And as the last rays of sunlight settled across the church steps behind them, both women realized that what they gained today was worth far more than the wedding that never happened. They gained the freedom that only truth can give. The following Monday arrived with a quietness that felt almost unreal. After the intensity of the weekend, Emma expected headlines, rumors, and endless messages. Instead, the world moved forward in its ordinary rhythm. Students still filled her classroom with paint-stained hands and unfinished projects. School bells still echoed through the hallways. Life, indifferent to drama, continued exactly as it always had. Yet something inside Emma had changed. As morning sunlight streamed through the windows of her art room, she found herself smiling more easily than she had in years. The weight she once carried had finally disappeared. Not because Ryan had suffered, not because anyone had been humiliated, because the last lingering shadow of her past no longer held power over her. Across town, Sophia sat alone in her gallery before opening hours. The spacious room felt peaceful in a way she had never fully appreciated before. Large windows overlooked the harbor where fishing boats drifted across calm water beneath a pale blue sky. For months, she had imagined what her wedding day would look like. She had pictured photographs, celebrations, speeches, and carefully planned memories. Yet none of those images had prepared her for the unexpected peace she felt now. Her phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the morning. Friends checked on her. Family members offered support. Even a few clients reached out with words of encouragement. The reaction surprised her. Fear had convinced her that choosing truth would lead to rejection. Instead, it had attracted respect. Shortly after noon, the gallery door opened. Sophia looked up and smiled immediately. Emma stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. I was not sure whether you would be here, Emma said. Sophia laughed softly. I was not sure either. The gallery felt different now, brighter somehow. The women settled near the front window where sunlight illuminated rows of paintings. For a while they simply talked. Not about Ryan, not about the wedding, about books, travel, art, future plans. It was the kind of conversation that happens when people stop being connected by pain and begin connecting through possibility. At one point, Sophia looked toward the harbor and shook her head. Do you know what is strange? Emma raised an eyebrow. What? For months I believed I was losing something valuable. She smiled faintly. Now I realize I was being given a second chance. Emma wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The warmth felt comforting against the cool autumn air drifting through the glass. Sometimes those are the same thing, she said. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. The words stayed with her. Later that afternoon, after Emma returned to school, Sophia received an unexpected visitor. Ryan stood outside the gallery. Through the window, she could see him hesitating before entering. The sight no longer stirred anxiety. It simply felt final. He stepped inside quietly. Gone was the confidence that once seemed inseparable from him. He looked tired, older somehow. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Ryan glanced around the gallery. It is beautiful, he said. Sophia smiled politely. Thank you. Another silence followed. Not hostile, Just honest. Ryan lowered his gaze. I came to apologize. The words appeared difficult for him. Sophia believed he meant them. I know. He nodded slowly. I spent a long time believing that if people questioned me, it meant they did not trust me. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. I never considered that trust has to be earned repeatedly. Sophia listened without interruption. Ryan looked toward the harbor outside. I am sorry. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Sophia studied him carefully. Then she smiled gently. I accept the apology. Relief flickered across his face. Not because forgiveness erased consequences. Because honesty finally existed between them. Ryan left a few minutes later. Neither asked to remain in each other's life. Neither promised friendship. Some relationships were not meant to continue. They were meant to teach. As evening settled over the harbor and golden sunlight shimmered across the water, Sophia stood beside the gallery window watching the day fade. For the first time since the wedding, she no longer thought about what might have been. She thought about what could be. And somewhere across town, Emma was doing exactly the same. 6 weeks passed. Autumn deepened across Connecticut, painting the landscape in shades of copper, gold, and crimson. The headlines that briefly circulated after the canceled wedding disappeared. The whispers faded. The speculation ended. Life moved on, as it always did. Yet for Emma and Sophia, those weeks became the beginning of something neither had expected. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a fairy tale. Something quieter. Something real. On a crisp Saturday morning, Emma stood beside a group of students at the community art fair held near the harbor. The air smelled of roasted coffee and fresh pastries drifting from nearby vendors. Children carried sketchbooks beneath colorful tents while local artists displayed paintings along the waterfront promenade. It was exactly the kind of event Emma loved. Simple, genuine, filled with people creating something meaningful. She was helping one of her students hang a watercolor painting when she heard a familiar voice behind her. I think that one is going to sell first. Emma turned and smiled. Sophia stood nearby wearing a camel-colored coat and a knitted cream scarf. She looked relaxed in a way Emma had never seen before. The constant tension that once lived behind her eyes was gone. You came, Emma said. Sophia laughed. I told you I would. Over the previous month, they had spent time together several times. Coffee by the harbor, lunch after work, long conversations that had nothing to do with Ryan. Their friendship had developed naturally, built not on shared disappointment, but on mutual respect. Sophia studied the student artwork displayed beneath the tent. They are talented. Emma glanced toward the children proudly. They remind me every day that starting over is not something to fear. Sophia smiled. That sounds familiar. Emma laughed softly. Maybe I am finally learning my own lessons. The morning passed pleasantly. Visitors admired paintings. Families wandered through the exhibits. Musicians performed near the waterfront. The entire town seemed wrapped in a sense of warmth despite the cooling temperatures. As the sun climbed higher, Sophia found herself standing beside the water watching small sailboats drift across the harbor. Emma joined her a moment later. For several minutes neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. The kind shared between people who no longer felt the need to fill every moment with words. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. Do you ever think about that day? Emma knew exactly which day she meant. She considered the question carefully. Less than I expected. Sophia nodded. Me too. A flock of seagulls swept across the water as sunlight danced along the surface of the harbor. The scene felt peaceful, complete. I spent years believing closure came from someone else, Sophia admitted. An apology, an explanation, some final conversation. Emma looked toward the horizon. And now? Sophia smiled. Now I think closure comes when you stop waiting for those things. Emma felt a quiet sense of agreement settle inside her. That was exactly what had happened. Neither woman had received a perfect ending. They had received something better. Freedom from needing one. Later that afternoon, as the art fair began winding down, several parents thanked Emma for her work with their children. One little girl proudly showed her family a painting she had completed that morning. The joy on her face made Emma smile. Sophia watched the interaction from nearby. You know, she said thoughtfully, for someone who thought she lost everything years ago, you built a pretty remarkable life. Emma looked surprised. Then she glanced around at the students, the artwork, the families, the harbor, the golden leaves drifting through the afternoon air. I suppose I did. Sophia smiled. You definitely did. The realization lingered long after the words were spoken. Because it was true. Emma had spent years focusing on what she lost. She rarely stopped to appreciate what she had created afterward. As the sun began setting beyond the harbor, casting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, both women stood quietly watching the water. Neither knew exactly what the future would bring. They did not need to know. The future was no longer something to fear or control. It was simply something to meet when it arrived. And standing there beneath the autumn sky, surrounded by the lives they had rebuilt with their own hands, both women finally understood that the greatest victory had never been walking away from the wrong person. It had been finding themselves afterward. Winter arrived quietly along the Connecticut shoreline. The harbor that had shimmered beneath autumn sunlight now reflected pale gray skies and the occasional dusting of snow along the docks. Boats rocked gently against their moorings while cold ocean air carried the scent of salt and cedar through the town. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm, the kind of rhythm that only appears after difficult seasons finally pass. On the first Saturday of December, Emma unlocked the doors to a small community art exhibition hosted by her students. Colorful paintings lined the walls. Handmade sculptures rested on display tables. Proud parents gathered beneath strings of warm white lights, carrying cups of coffee while admiring the work of young artists. Laughter echoed softly through the building. It was not a grand event. There were no reporters, no expensive decorations, no dramatic speeches. Yet standing there among her students, Emma felt richer than she ever had during the years she spent chasing someone else's definition of success. Across the room, Sophia arrived carrying a tray of pastries from a local bakery. Snowflakes clung to the shoulders of her dark wool coat. The moment she stepped inside, several students greeted her enthusiastically. Over the past few months, she had become a familiar presence, quietly supporting community programs and local art initiatives. Emma smiled as Sophia approached. You brought enough pastries to feed the entire town. Sophia laughed. I may have gotten carried away. They stood together watching families move through the exhibit. The atmosphere felt warm despite the winter chill outside. Children proudly explained their artwork. Parents took photographs. Teachers shared stories. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary. And that was precisely what made it beautiful. As the afternoon continued, Emma found herself standing beside a large window overlooking the snow-covered street. Sophia joined her a few moments later. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt comfortable, familiar. Finally, Sophia smiled. Do you realize it has been almost 3 months? Emma knew exactly what she meant. She nodded slowly. It feels longer somehow. In a good way. Emma looked out at the falling snow. Tiny white flakes drifted beneath streetlights already glowing in the early winter afternoon. You know, she said thoughtfully. For years I believed my story ended when my marriage ended. Sophia listened quietly. Emma smiled. I never imagined that was actually where it began. The words lingered between them, because they were true. The most important chapter of Emma's life had not been the one where she lost someone. It had been the one where she found herself afterward. Nearby, a young girl excitedly pointed toward a watercolor painting hanging on the wall. Her parents applauded while she beamed with pride. Emma watched the scene with a soft smile. Those simple moments mattered more than she once understood. The small victories, the peaceful mornings, the friendships built on honesty, the freedom to wake up each day without pretending. Sophia followed her gaze. You seem happy. Emma considered the observation carefully. Then she nodded. I am. Not because everything was perfect. Not because life had suddenly become easy. Because happiness had stopped depending on other people. It had become something she created for herself. Outside, the snow continued falling. The town glowed beneath soft white light as evening slowly approached. Families began gathering their coats and saying goodbye. The exhibition was ending. Yet neither woman felt sad. Endings no longer frightened them. They understood now that endings often create space for better beginnings. As the final visitors departed, Emma walked through the gallery one last time, turning off lights and straightening displays. Sophia helped stack chairs near the entrance. Together they stepped outside into the quiet winter evening. Snowflakes drifted gently around them. The harbor beyond the town shimmered beneath distant lights. Everything felt calm, complete. Emma looked toward the dark water and thought about the woman she used to be. The woman who sat alone in the final row of a chapel believing she was attending the closing chapter of her story. She smiled softly. That woman had no idea what was waiting ahead. She had no idea that peace would arrive in such an unexpected form. She had no idea that dignity would matter more than revenge. She had no idea that the greatest victory would not come from watching someone else lose. It would come from finally becoming whole again. Beside her, Sophia smiled as they began walking through the softly falling snow. Behind them, the lights of the exhibition faded one by one. Ahead of them stretched a future neither could fully see. But for the first time, that uncertainty felt beautiful. Because some stories do not end when the truth is revealed. Some stories begin there. And as the winter night settled gently over the harbor, both women moved forward carrying something no one could ever take from them again. Their peace.